I'm Lise Wheel with Law&Crime. We have just heard the prosecution's rebuttal argument in this case, and I'm going to bring in two experts with me. Emily Kamana from Seattle. She comes from us from Seattle. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Lise. Thanks for having me today.
It's great to have you with us. Emily, what did you think about the prosecution's rebuttal there just in the last couple of minutes?
I thought it was really persuasive, and I think it's interesting that he really focused on a few highlights in the defense's closing, raised those specific questions. So, for example, he brought up what was found in the well. These are specific items that there's no way, as defense said, this well was basically a trash bin for decades. Well, how would certain things have been found in that trash for decades that were related to that murder? For example, that shoe, that Adidas chain, the sweater. And I also note as well that the prosecutor in his closing, his rebuttal, he mentions a few items of knowledge that the witness knew that he said had not been released to the press yet. He said only the killer would know that. And what's interesting for viewers to remember is that there are multiple right now in this investigation that were members of law enforcement that have been looked for obstruction here, and that what the details were withheld, but for viewers to understand there might have been, or there's certainly an insinuation of on defense's part, that information was leaking that way. So it remains to see whether the jury found that very persuasive or whether it just brings more questions to them as well.
Exactly. What did you think of the fact that really here you have these snitches really that have testified about, you know, something that happened 30 years ago, that testimony, you got the testimony, but you don't have, you know, real evidence, as in, you know, DNA evidence, that the prosecution, I mean, the defense, excuse me, made a big deal of the fact that you don't have that DNA evidence. The defense made something of, well, you know, I've got this size 10 shoe, and look at this, and they made a big deal of that, but they don't have that critical DNA evidence that the defense made a big deal of, and that snitch evidence, you know, well, you know, that can really cut both ways. What did you make of that in this case, especially because it's so old?
Absolutely, I agree. I think if we're comparing these apples to oranges here, I do feel that defense was more persuasive for those reasons. He said, look, they really harped on the credibility aspect of these jailhouse informants. He said, right, he might be in front of you wearing casual clothes right now, but he was just in striped clothes. And he also hammered on something very important, which was that the level of detail that filled in these jailhouse informant story increased through the years. And he brought up the fact, look, one of them was only 10 at the time. How could he have remembered and seen Gebhardt that day enough to tell us about it decades later when he was quiet before 2017?
Exactly.
Absolutely persuasive in that regard.
Right. Emily, thank you. Hold on for a minute here. I want to bring in Jessica Jackson Sloan. Jessica, thank you so much for being with us. Jessica, one thing that was really sort of struck me is that even in the prosecution's rebuttal, the prosecution said several times, well, this evidence is consistent with being stabbed, Wow, consistent with being, that's not that great if you're the prosecution. Consistent with being something, you want it to be, this is how it has to be, not consistent with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is an interesting case because on the one hand, you've got the defense who's sitting there saying, look, you're not going to like the defendant. He is a racist. You're not going to like the things you hear about him, but he didn't do it, and they can't prove he did it because there's just not the evidence. And then on the other side, you have the state saying, you know, we may not have the evidence, but we've got, you know, the snitch evidence, the jailhouse informants. Right. We've got these other statements by him, and really trying to play on the emotional aspect. You know, he started that rebuttal by laying out all of the emotional pieces that go into this, the dragging, the, you know, scene in the bar, just really trying to build the emotional case with the jury, because I think it's clear nobody in the courtroom really likes Mr. Gebhardt, right, at this point. And they're really trying to fulfill their gap in actual evidence and even their gap in theory and being able to prove their theory by bringing up all this emotions and disdain for both, the actual hateful, horrible crime that happened here, but also for Mr. Gebhardt.
Well, that's right. You have a crime here that happened. It happened horribly. They went through it again and again and again in the rebuttal as well. You got to find somebody that is guilty for this. What did you think stylistically about the way that this rebuttal went on? It did go on for a bit long. I wondered about whether he was going through so many of the particulars of the defense, trying to rebut so many particulars of the defense. Did it look a little bit, from the prosecution's perspective, a little bit defensive from a prosecutor's perspective?
Yeah, I think it did look a little bit defensive. I would have picked maybe my top three. The jury's heard the rest of it at this point, but going in and reminding them of individual statements like the Jack Daniels bottle, right, and pushing on those, it did seem a little defensive and certainly went on a little long for a rebuttal.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, ladies. I want you to stay with us because right now we are going to go to Kentucky, because while this has been going on and we have had the closings and very dramatic closings in this case from 1983, a cold case from 1983 and a very, very important case from 1983, we've been calling it the Marine case all along, the Sean Gray case. And in Kentucky, it is now also in closing arguments. And I want to go live into the courtroom there. So ladies, hang on with me. We're going to come back for analysis, but let's go into the courtroom live in Kentucky and hear what's going on there in closing arguments. Yes, I'm Elise Wheel, back with my esteemed guests here today, Emily Compagno out in Seattle and Jessica Jackson Sloan in San Francisco. And we've been, as you've been watching, the defense give their closing argument and what we've been calling the Marine case, but it's actually Defendant Canada there in Kentucky. We've been researching Kentucky law as to try to figure out, between the three of us, why it is that the defense is actually going first in giving the closing arguments in a murder case like this. Not only a murder case, a death penalty murder case. And ladies, I'll have you chime in here, but the three of us, we can't find anything in the jurisdiction to tell us why defense would go first in a closing argument, letting the prosecution then have definitely the last word. Emily, I'll go to you first.
I mean, short or notwithstanding of some type of jurisdictional or in-court rules, it seems to me a really damning strategy. If this was some type of elective strategy on part of defense, I mean, again, this is a capital case and the stakes are extremely high. So I agree. I'm not quite sure strategically why this would ever be undertaken short of a court rule.
Well, we've seen several trials where defense goes first and state last, and prosecution has the last word. But it just seems like from the defense perspective, though we've seen it, it seems like as a strategy, do you think it's a winning strategy, Jessica? Would you try this if you were a defense lawyer in this case?
Absolutely not. I would want to leave the jury with my thoughts. So I don't think that this is a winning strategy. If it is some strategy they've come up with, but I would want to leave the jury, or in this case, two juries, with my thoughts as to, what had happened in my closing argument, especially because it's a pretty emotional case as well.
Okay. All right. Let's go back to the courtroom and see what the defense is doing now in the courtroom in Kentucky. Yeah. All right, that was the defense case, the defense closing, the Compagno Canada case, the death penalty case out in Kentucky. We did find a statute out in Kentucky which says that the defense does go first in the closing arguments in Kentucky, which is very unusual. So the defense goes first, and now the prosecution will have its shot. This closing was really very much about what the prosecution hasn't shown you. It hasn't shown you the composite. It's got 4 cell phones. Why do you need 4 cell phones? You should only have 1. No identification. Remember when the widow of Jonathan Price took the stand, Megan, she herself had been shot. She couldn't actually make the ID on the stand. So it was really about what the prosecution didn't show you, trying to poke holes in what the prosecution has not been able to show you. Quickly to Emily out in Seattle, what did you think of the defense here in what they did?
I thought it was interesting, just as you said. I also want to note for viewers and highlight how in his closing, defense counsel also highlighted what prosecution failed to do in the investigation. They failed to follow up with people that came forward with supposed evidence. As he said, people are not hacked, people are attorneys. So I think he highlighted also that in the procedure, the conclusion that the DA came up with, as he said, it failed to include everything and potentially evidence that would absolve my client. I think he did a good job of highlighting everything. I will say stylistically, I think it was hard to follow for the jury. And I think it's really important, given that statute, the fact that defense goes before prosecution in closing, he needed to wrap it up sooner. He needed to do a little bit more of kind of bullet stylistically at the end and say, X, Y, Z, and here, that is what reasonable doubt is. I fear that in terms of neutrality, the jury will forget much of what he said because it was buried in the details.
It really seemed to me as well to be buried in the details, but who knows what the jury is thinking right now. And Jessica, what about you? What were your reactions to stylistically and elsewhere, just the factually what he presented here in the defense?
Stylistically, I think it was a little bit slow. It was very methodical, it felt. Definitely a regurgitation of evidence that had been presented throughout the trial, but then again, it's been a long trial, so it might have been beneficial for the jurors to hear that. I think another thing he did is remembering that jurors are lay people. They're not people who sit on juries every single day, so they actually don't know what is normal to hear in a trial. So he did a great job going through methodically, pointing out this is not normal, this is not normal. They should have shown you the following pieces of evidence. Smells like reasonable doubt to me. So I thought that overall, even though it was slow and methodical, he did a good job driving home that this is not the normal prosecution case to meet that important burden.
All right, speaking of prosecution, stay around because now we're going to hear what the prosecution does. The defense now, the defendant, the defense now goes, we'll hear what they say. We'll be right back with analysis after that. Okay, we're in the midst of the defense here, the second defendant giving her closing defense argument. And I want to bring in Jessica here. Well, how do you think now we've got the second defendant and the second closing argument? How do you think it's sort of the same kind of argument in what the prosecution hasn't shown? Here, what they really are going at is the lineup here, that it's sort of a suspect lineup in that the person who made the identification really wasn't that clear in making the identification. Wasn't 100%, wasn't even 95%. What do you make of that? How strong do you think that is for a defense closing argument? Jessica.
I think, again, they're going a lot in the weeds here. It's been a very long trial. They want to remind the jury of what the prosecution has not done. I also kind of want to recognize another theme that's come up in both defense closing arguments, and that has been the lack of resources. I think this is kind of a zoom out question. They've talked about the lack of resources. There's been a lot in the papers about the public defenders not having the resources to actually take this case, and that resulted in some lengthy delays that upset the family. They've talked in the closing about the prosecution having to rush the investigation and not, having enough investigators to get out there
having to find somebody.
And I think this to me signals a larger question that we're looking at across the country, which is the issue of mass incarceration taking up so many resources that we actually have an epidemic of us becoming less safe because all these resources are being taken up by incarcerating people who don't really need to be incarcerated. And instead, we don't have the resources for the cases that really matter, like the shooting of Marine Officer Price and his wife.
Well, exactly. I mean, here we have Jonathan Price and his wife Megan, who were shot in the leg. Jonathan Price, of course, died trying to defend his wife. So I don't think anybody would argue that, we've got to get these people, whoever did this crime, whether it's these two people that are actually being charged now or whoever did it. I mean, this is a death penalty case. So we've got to get this right. But the question, I guess, here in this closing argument is they're really focusing on the lineup. Was it rushed? And I guess to your point was it a rushed lineup? Did they, was the person who was making that ID, the person making the ID said, and the defense made this point, I feel like it's more like this or that, that's not 100% now, is it, Emily?
Exactly. And I think it resonates with the jury to have them kind of recall moments where they've been uncertain, right? That's superhuman. That's a totally human quality. And so it's smart for her stylistically to kind of be hammering on this because everyone's been unsure. The fact that she also calls into play that national epidemic, just as Jessica just said, is
Right.
It's smart because it means that in the jury's deliberations, we'll have that bird's eye view and say, am I going to be one more statistic here, which is kind of a casualty or a victim of this rushed situation of Compagno, all these factors combined that leads to potentially wrongful conviction. I don't want to participate in something like that. I need to listen closely. Stylistically, she's much more persuasive. She's faster. She's easier to follow. I think she does a good job of being methodical while also at the same time being easy and simple to follow. So the jury, it's easy to follow her, and as she connects the dots with planting that reasonable doubt or highlighting the reasonable doubt that the jury here should find according to them.
And of course, nobody wants to be part of a rush to judgment. So let's go back to the courtroom. Thank you so much, ladies. We'll come back to you in a few moments. Let's go back to the courtroom now and see what the defense lawyer has to say on her continuation of her closing argument. I'm going to have to let the lovely Emily Compagno go in just a minute. But before I do that, I'm going to ask her a question, and along with Jessica as well. But first to Emily. You know, the defense here is doing a really great job in saying what there isn't. And she says I have this wonderful story about the cell phone, right, with her defendant that, you know, a much easier story is to say, a much easier way to say is, look, the cell phone, a much convoluted way to say the cell phone was there because it was with his girlfriend, not what the prosecution would have you say is, you know, the prosecution, the cell phone, you'd have to believe that the cell phone transferred here and there and everywhere, right? So believe the easier story, which is my story, which gives him an alibi. Kind of makes sense if you believe, you know, always believe the easier story, right?
Exactly, right? That's what we're always taught, is to believe the simpler version, because that's oftentimes or mostly where the truth lies. I think she's doing an excellent job calling into question the causal relationship between the robbery that occurred prior to this murder and the murder in question, and highlighting the fact that the alibi is strong here, right? So I think she's really hammering home and doing a good job that the strength of the prosecution's case, or one of the strongest parts of the prosecution's case, involves that causal link, involves the circumstantial and causation links, ties in that prior robbery. And there, he hasn't even yet to go into the forensics yet. They're going to call into question as well the expert testimony that we heard earlier. So that's an important thing to note as well. And also for listeners and viewers, so a lot of the cell phone data that has been coming to the forefront in terms of evidence, and also in terms of what we're seeing now in the realm of data privacy and consumer privacy. So look as well for that to be highlighted here and potentially an appeal. I'm not getting ahead of myself. It's just something that we put into their back pocket, that anytime you bring in cell phone data, it opens a whole can of worms.
Emily, thank you so much. Really appreciate your staying with us for this time, and we'll see you back here on Law&Crime. Thank you so much. And Jessica Jackson Sloan, before you take off, I want to ask you a question, if you wouldn't mind. Back on this, the gun. She goes into the gun as well. And how can you really place the gun with my guy, right? She does a very, very persuasive argument with that. What did you think?
Yeah, I think that is going to be very persuasive because we're looking at a lot of other evidence missing. This is the one thing they're really hanging their hat on. So if she can poke a hole in the prosecution's theory when it comes to the gun. Then she's done her job well.
Yeah. I thought it was very persuasive. So thank you so much, Jessica, for being here with us, and we'll have you back on Law&Crime very, very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, I'm Lise Wheel. I'm going to stay with you here. Just to let you know, in Georgia, the Gebhardt case, you know, that case, that 1983 case that we've been following, cold case since 1983, not cold anymore. We've been following it. The Gebhardt case has, the jury has gone home, but they'll be back in for jury deliberation tomorrow. So you're not missing anything there, but we're going to go back to court now, live here in Kentucky. So let's go back in and hear what the defense is still saying in this case.